So, as Aldo said, I was the researcher and advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Magdalena Sepulveda was from Chile. She sent her regards to all of you. She actually has just finished her term after 6 years. So I'm just going to briefly explain the Special Rapporteur system for those of you who don't know what it is. So the UN Human Rights Council appoints a number of independent experts to look at particular country situations and particular issues. These experts are independent of the UN and of states. They don't receive any pay, and they usually serve for 6 years. So Magdalena was appointed the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights in 2008, with a mandate to look at the obstacles that people living in poverty all over the world experience in realising their human rights. So our previous reports that we've worked on have been on issues like social protection and social security, access to justice for people living in poverty, and participation in public and political life. And for the last report, we decided to tackle the issue of fiscal policy. And during the process of developing the report, this was narrowed down mostly just to looking at tax. And our decision was motivated by several factors. A number of our close allies, some of whom are sitting in this room, were urging us to tackle this issue. And we also saw there was a growing urgency around tax justice debates, and that there was an emerging movement towards linking tax and human rights on both sides of the bridge. And when we thought about it, it actually seemed a very fitting last report for Magdalena's term as Special Rapporteur. Because after all the things, resources and revenue are a precondition for all the things that she had been asking governments to do during her whole mandate. Improve social security systems, make justice systems more accessible to people living in poverty, improving public service provision in disadvantaged and remote communities. Resources are an absolute precondition for all of these things. So, as Aldo said, the report is available now. I will just flag one small thing, which is that the version that's available now is an advanced version, and there are a few mistakes in it that were made by the editors, I would like to say, not us. So the final, we're battling with the UN at the moment to try and correct those errors, and the final version should be available soon, but you can very much get the gist of things from the report that's currently available. And I'd also like to say that this was very much a collaborative endeavour. Magdalena and I worked on this very closely with various human rights advocates and tax justice campaigners to develop the ideas and to write the report and to get feedback on the drafts. And lots of people in this room played really important roles in that, so thank you very much. But all the errors are us and the editors of the UN. So, and I will also just say that there are some areas where I'm sure some of you in this room would have liked the report to have gone further. There are some political constraints on Special Rapporteur's work that are unavoidable. So, but I hope you felt that it's a useful tool. So going into the project, I was not a tax expert at all, but I have, through the process of working on this, become somewhat evangelical about the issue. And I won't go through all the reasons why tax is important for human rights, because Ignacio and others have done this very ably already. I will just say that given the focus of the mandate on poverty, it was also very important for us to make the links with poverty and to make the case that this was a really important issue for development and poverty reduction. So, of course, very obviously, lost or foregone tax revenue is money that can't be spent on tackling poverty. So, just a statistic for you, in 2011, developing countries lost nearly $1 trillion to illicit financial flows, about 80% of which is via tax evasion. And according to the OECD, this is more than 7 times the official development assistance for that year, and substantially more than the estimated costs of achieving all the Millennium Development Goals. So the impact is huge. And secondly, people living in poverty are the ones that feel the impact when there is insufficient revenue to spend on public services or social protection. They can't afford to go private or to pay bribes, and they often live in areas where the state is already pretty much absent. So, in terms of the report, our aim was to clarify what international human rights law and principles imply for tax policies, to provide guidance to states, and to get more human rights advocates and institutions to consider tax issues. And the focus of the report is global, so it is, by its very nature, quite general. The aim is to identify general principles and obligations and to analyse particular types of policy and practice from a human rights perspective. And I'd also just like to say that we don't just look at tax abuse, as in the very good IBA report, we're also looking at things like low levels of tax collection, tax to GDP ratio, regressive versus progressive taxation, low corporate tax rates, etc. So, as Ignacio said earlier, tax is not explicitly mentioned in human rights treaties, but there are many relevant areas. And Ignacio's already done some of my job for me, which is great. So I'm just going to go through a few of the key areas of the report very briefly and explain how the report deals with them. So first of all, the issue of maximum available resources, which was mentioned earlier, which is enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I'll just talk about some of the ways that we applied this to tax policy. So I think what's really important to note is that in this concept that states have to spend maximum available resources on the realisation of economic, social and cultural rights, available does not just mean that the money that's sitting in the Treasury waiting for the government to spend it. It also means things like loans, ODA, and money that could potentially and reasonably be collected through taxation. And certainly I think it's very clear that a state is not fulfilling its obligation to use maximum available resources if it's allowing billions that could be spent on schools and hospitals to go abroad to tax havens or giving huge tax breaks to transnational corporations, or indeed not taxing wealthy individuals sufficiently. The next thing I'll talk about briefly that we talk about in the report is the principles of non-discrimination and equality. Now these of course are core human rights principles. They apply in all state actions. These provisions are included in every single international human rights treaty and indeed every single regional human rights treaty. And there are also some dedicated treaties that are dedicated to combating discrimination against particular groups. For example, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So the next panel is going to be about tax and gender, so I'm not going to talk about that now, but suffice to say that tax certainly has quite profound gender impacts, so it's not just relevant for socio-economic inequality. We looked at things like progressive versus regressive taxation. As all of you in this room know, the impact of regressive taxation falls mainly on the poor, but of course increasingly governments are relying more and more on regressive taxation in the tax mix. This has been true in developing countries for some time, partly due to IMF imposition, but increasingly this is happening in industrialized countries as well because of austerity measures. So just throwing another statistic at you, which shows the impact of high regressive taxation on the poorest in Latin America. On average, the poorest 20% of the population, for them, sales tax accounts for 13.7% of their income, while only 5.8% for the richest 20%. So despite various exemptions aimed at decreasing the burden on lower income groups, the poor bear a tax burden 2.4 times higher than that of the wealthiest people. And there was a very good presentation on Brazil yesterday, which made me think, because Brazil, of course, is lauded for its social programs, but the way the tax mix is distributed seriously limits the redistributive, I can never say that word, the redistributive aspects of these social programs, because they're effectively being paid for by the people they're meant to be benefiting. So, human rights obligations, under non-discrimination, the human rights obligations actually require governments to prioritise the rights of the most disadvantaged. International human rights law is concerned with substantive, de facto equality, which of course implies affirmative action. So progressive direct taxation, pro-poor exemptions and redistribution is necessary in order for states to be able to respect and fulfil the rights of people living in poverty. And one way to illustrate the difference between a kind of conventional conservative understanding of discrimination and the human rights understanding of discrimination is by looking at a flat tax. So a flat tax, although supposedly treating everyone equally, is only non-discriminatory in the most superficial sense, obviously. Under human rights law, a difference in treatment does not equal discrimination, as long as it's aimed at giving an advantage to the most disadvantaged. So a flat tax does not address structural disadvantage, it does not encourage equal enjoyment of human rights, and it limits the redistributive function of taxation. Thirdly, I'll just talk briefly about extraterritorial obligations. This was something we talked about in the report also. I think this is a really key area because it's one where there's a lot of misconception. states absolutely do have duties to people beyond their borders. They're obliged to respect and protect the human rights of people everywhere. So this involves, for example, avoiding conduct that would foreseeably risk impairing the enjoyment of human rights of people beyond their borders, refraining from conduct that impairs the ability of another state to comply with its own human rights commitments, and as well creating an international enabling environment for the fulfillment of economic, social and cultural rights. So you can think of many examples where states are undermining this, their duties in this regard in the area of tax. I mean, if you just think about, for example, the UK, by presiding over a tax haven such as Jersey, say a multinational corporation that's mining in Mozambique and is avoiding its tax in Mozambique by funneling all the profits to Jersey, clearly that action is impacting on the ability of Mozambique to realise the economic, social and cultural rights of its population. And this has a direct impact on the residents of developing countries. In terms of the recommendations of the report, it looks at particular measures and actions necessary to realise human rights through tax policy and to ensure that tax policy does not violate or jeopardise human rights. I won't go through all of these recommendations. Obviously, you can look at the report, many of them will be very familiar to you already, but they include things like tackling tax abuses, relying more on progressive direct taxation in the tax mix, international tax cooperation and transparency, and things like the introduction of a financial transaction tax. So I'd also like to make clear that although the report and the recommendations are addressed to states, because states are the main duty bearers of human rights obligations and they're also the main interlocutors of Special Rapporteur's reports, it's of course important also to recognise the role of business and their responsibility to respect human rights. Ignacio mentioned this earlier. This responsibility is included in soft law, the guiding principles on business and human rights. I will say that there is a movement towards binding international human rights standards on businesses. That's probably a long way off, but watch this space. And business practices that avoid taxation, they clearly breach this responsibility to respect human rights. For example, estimates in many African countries show that revenue losses from tax incentives, from corporate tax incentives, were between 2 and 8% of GDP. Given that many African countries only spend between 2 and 5% of GDP on health, this is obviously a huge impact. So business enterprises that knowingly avoid paying tax or lobby to avoid paying tax through these type of incentives are purposely depriving countries of the resources they need to fulfil their human rights obligations. And this is something we emphasise in the report. Right, I'm just going to wrap up now. I'm just going to conclude by talking about what is the status of this report, what can it do, why is it useful, why is it important. Well, its impact and its importance actually relies on all of you, because it has been presented to the Human Rights Council now, so it's an official UN report. It will eventually be translated into 5 other languages, so it will be available in all the 6 UN languages, official UN languages. But it requires civil society to take the report and run with it and to push for its recommendations. And we also hope that it will have an impact on human rights treaty bodies, human rights courts, and national human rights institutions, and also other special rapporteurs in giving them a growing willingness and an arsenal of measures to examine fiscal policy. So hopefully it might spur some interesting human rights research and interesting human rights jurisprudence and some soft law on tax policy and human rights. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.